Hey, it's time for a live event. We are live today working on a project that's a little bit of a remake. So if you have seen the mini charmer in the past, we're going to make it a Christmas charm today. And because the fabrics that come in those little 2.5-inch squares by Moda are called candy, that's the pre-cut shape, it's called candy. I decided to name my version Christmas Candy. So then it makes sense that we're using Christmas fabric with the candy size 2.5-inch pre-cut squares. So the pattern will be in the comment section so that you can, if you haven't downloaded already, you can go in and download that pattern. At the end, if you'd like to just find something to take notes on for now, that's great. But don't forget to download the pattern. Also, remember that in the chat section or the comment section under this video is where you can put in your questions. Let us know where you're watching from. Kelly from Arizona, we saw that you were already watching and waiting for us to start today. We love to see our quilters come back every other week to join us. And remember to share that you enjoy National Quilters Circle Facebook Live events with your quilt guilds, small groups, your quilt friends. If you're going to a show, tell somebody about it because there's a lot of good content here for them. And we love to grow our community. Thanks for being a part of it. We already have Diana saying good morning from Ohio. Karen, who says hello from northern Minnesota. We're glad that you've joined us. Now, remember that the pattern you're going to see is going to have a picture of some Christmas fabric on the cover of it, but you will see the original mini charmer in the photo also. So you'll see a couple of different ways that it can be interpreted. Now, when I made this one, I had so much fun with those little mini charms that I kept kind of an eye out for those little candy pre-cuts when I was shopping. And I was at a show recently and I just couldn't resist. This one was called Christmas Eve from Moda. And the fabrics in it were just so classically Christmas, which is kind of my Christmas flavor, I guess, that I picked it up, even though they didn't have any of the yardage available, it just had the candy. And I figured, well, eventually I'll find it. Well, I did. I found yardage when I was shopping from the line so I could add it too. That just makes your shopping adventure that much more fun because you have something on your list to go looking for. Okay, we have Diane saying hello from Omaha and Donna who's saying hello from Illinois. Lofty Design says hello from Mooresville, North Carolina. And Bridget says hello from France. We are so glad you're here to join us today. So that Christmas candy, those 2.5-inch pre-cut little squares make the perfect little runner like this. Now, you will notice that if you count the number of squares in here, that I did not use all 42 because there were some of the very super light or white background ones that I could then veto and take back out if I like. That's what's nice about this. It gives you a little flexibility on which of the pieces in the pre-cut you will decide to use. So you'll just have a very few left over. I think that this project is really geared at teaching two things. Arranging color, which all of us need to work on, me included. I was working on a project this week, moving pieces around until I got the lights and darks and the mediums moved apart and scattered evenly. So color arrangement. And the other thing this one teaches is diagonal settings. Without having to do a gigantic, huge quilt, you can learn the technique of putting things together. If you look at this table runner, these are setting on point. So that means we're going to create this and put it together in diagonal rows with what we call setting triangles on the outer corners. And we will walk through how to cut those in the instructions and a tool that helps us do those really well off of strips or the traditional method. I always give you both here so that you can learn about the diagonal setting and kind of get used to the idea of how it's kind of each row is a little offset because it kind of plays with our brain. we're used to putting things together in straight rows across or straight rows up and down and matching things. But when you do offset of the diagonal rows, it plays a little with our equilibrium. We're like, wait a minute, I got to slide that just a little bit more. That's where the seam has to intersect. So it's a really good practice, this project on color placement and the diagonal setting of a quilt top. So let's get started on our project. I'm going to set this back out of the way for right now. Now, let's see. The things that we will need, the supplies that you will need. Whoops, just a second. Marianne says, hello from Ohio. Christine says, good morning from Idaho City, Idaho. Susan says, good morning from Kansas. And we've got Peggy saying, hello from Ankeny. Oh, Ankeny's just up the road from me. Yay. And Kim, who says, hello from Shelbyville, Georgia, I believe that is. Very good. We are glad that you're here. Now, as you see this little mini charmer or Christmas candy come to life, think about what genre you would like to make one of these in. Would it be Easter spring? Would it be patriotic for your country? Would it be, maybe it's going to be Christmas, but kind of get thinking about if I run across some of those pre-cuts, or you can cut 2.5-inch squares out of your stash of fabrics. That works too. And think about the leftovers from quilts. When you buy a kit, you tend to have strips of fabric left over for just those incidental cases of a miscut. Well, you could easily cut 2.5-inch squares from those too. So maybe you already have coordinated from a quilt project some fabrics that would work for this. You don't have to have 40, 42 different fabrics. You can just have a selection of your own choosing. So from this, we've got the charms or your cut pieces cut from your fabrics. We've got a background fabric. And I decided to use a grunge fabric that was kind of a little bit of a gray to it because the background of the border fabric that I bought had a little gray tone to it. And then I bought an accent, which I'm going to be using instead of the stripe. The stripe was so much fun to use in this project. In the inner border and the binding, I decided to go with a bright red here that will kind of act as an inner mat. You know, when you're matting a picture, that tiny little inside edge and then a frame. So I decided that one of the reds from that line would make a great combination to create that nice line that would outline the piecing and then outline the border. Because I don't usually use a light color for border very often, but if I'm going to put the border with red on both sides of it, it stands out nicely. So I decided that sometimes a light border will work. So this is the combination that I chose for my project. Then you're going to need some backing fabric. It tells you approximately how much backing or batting you will need. In this project, I'm going to use a ruler that is by Omnigrid. It was designed by Fons and Porter Group, and it's called a 1/2 ruler. So if you decide that you want to purchase that, it's a tool that you will use again, I promise you. I use it quite often when I decide that I want to cut triangles from strips, which is very efficient, which you'll see in the demo soon. So this is the by Omnigrid, the Fons and Porter 1/2 ruler. So I'm going to use that, or you can use a standard square ruler that you have in your collection to cut them the traditional method. Okay, so let's get into the cutting portion of this project. What we need to do is cut. We've got everything pre-cut here. We don't have to worry about any of our little squares. We are going to be cutting those setting triangles that are in white in the original project. They're going to be that very, very pale gray in the next version. But we need to cut those triangles properly with the grain of the fabric going in the right direction. We don't want bias on the outer edge of our project. So we're going to cut them a special way. Faye says, good morning from Southeast Pennsylvania. We've got Mary saying hello from Portland, Tennessee. And Robert says, oh, yay, a stash buster. Well, it's a mini stash buster because these are pretty small pieces, but anything out of your stash is something you've already invested in and you probably already love. So this is one way to have fun with that. And then get some tasty candy. Yes, those little pre-cuts were just calling my name and they had to come home with me. Sorry. Okay, so we're going to talk about the cutting because that background, we're going to use that 1/2 1/4 ruler that I talked about. And in order to cut those triangles, we can cut them off of strips using this tool. If you're not confident in what you're doing at first, it's always best to cut one at a time. Once you kind of get confident of what you're doing and how you're cutting, then you can cut multiples, but always be aware of how many layers you have going on when you cut those. Okay, so on this project, we would need 4 outer corners, correct? And then we need the ones that go along the sides in order to be the proper orientation. Okay, so let's think about that. On the corners, we want straight of grain out here on the outer edge, the 2 short legs, which means the bias edge is going to be the long leg. So let's cut one of those the proper direction. With this tool, you can cut 1/2 square triangles and 1/4 square triangles. I know that's a lot if you're brand new to quilting, but trust me, the 1/2 square triangle is what we want off of this strip. In your instructions, it tells you how wide the strip is, and these are cut. If you're using the tool, they are, let me find it, 2-inch strips. On the tool, it will tell you down the side, the strip width, 2-inch, go down to the 2-inch line. We're going to set this on the bottom edge of our strip. The solid yellow triangle will extend off of the strip and above the strip. So we're laying this onto the strip. I've already made a right angle on the beginning, but make sure that you have a right angle with your strip at the beginning. I've got that cleaned up and straight already. The 2-inch line on one end of my strip, the little yellow triangle extending off the top. And then I cut a triangle so that I have one of my outer corners ready to go. This is straight of grain. This is straight of grain. That diagonal cut I just made is the bias edge, which will go to the interior of my project. And then I can just rotate to cut 4 of those so that I would have all 4 for the outer edge of my project. 1, 2, and then I would continue 3 and 4. But I have a few already cut and ready to go. Now, in order to cut the other triangles, the side triangles, these are a little bit larger ones. Again, the orientation is bias on the short end this time here. It's different. And the long leg is going to be straight of grain. In order to achieve that off the strip, we're going to use this end of our tool. It has a little tiny black triangle at the very top. It says strip width on the side, which I love because I do not like having to track down instructions for tools. I love it that it's right on there and it's easy to read. Strip width, go down to the 2-inch line. Set that 2-inch line at the bottom of my strip. The little black triangle goes up off the end or off the top. And then I cut both sides. This time, so I begin. Now I have a triangle that has straight of grain along the bottom, the long leg. The 2 short legs are bias, which is going to be on the interior of my project. So I have one ready to go. And when it has a blunt top, don't fear, you've done it correctly. That's okay. Then we just rotate the tool down the strip. Again, this time I'm putting the 2-inch line at the very top. I'm extending that black little triangle off the bottom and cutting the next angle. Now I have a second one cut. Then I can just proceed down the strip until I get all of the 18 1/4 square triangles that I need for this project. It goes fairly simple. If at any time the cut on this side seems to the left of the tool seems a little bit wonky, cut another one. Now, the reason why I want to cut 4 of these is because I want to rearrange those triangles and remind you of what we just cut. Quarter square triangles means they are quarters that came out of a square, like this, blown apart. So we have 4 triangles. They come from a square, but the proper orientation of the bias edges will occur in our quilt. When we did the half square triangles, if we line these, we would get a square. Yes, there's some blunted corners, but that's okay. It's not a problem because those are dog-eared areas that are going to get trimmed anyway. So 2 of those half square triangles makes a square, and we have those oriented properly. Whoops. So that means we have all of the pieces for aligning and arranging the center portion of our project ready to go. Let's see. We've got Joanne saying good morning from Manitoba, Canada. Frida from, I can never say it right, Mantalolin Island? I need a pronunciation key. I'm sorry. Karen says hello from Ohio, and Deb says Eastern Iowa. Way to go. Good morning. We are glad you are here with us. Okay, so we have all those triangles set or cut. Now it's time to actually just do the arrangement. This is probably one of the hardest parts. Oops, I was going to show you the traditional cutting. Sorry. As I move my pieces, I realize, okay, if you don't have the half and quarter ruler and you decide, I don't want to buy another ruler, you probably have a square, correct? So that means that you're going to cut, and your instructions will tell you for the outer corners what size square to cut. It's a 2 3/8 inch square, and you're going to cut it diagonally once. So just cut that square and then cut it apart. You'll need 4 of those, of course. For the size, you're going to need quarter squares, which means you're going to need a 4 1/4 inch square like this. And then when you go to cut it apart, you're going to cut it twice to get quarter squares. Now, some will say, why didn't you do that to start out with? Because that's the traditional method for cutting setting triangles. Well, it is, but as projects get larger and larger, this square that you're required to have gets larger and larger. And it's much easier to cut them off of strips efficiently instead of having to cut large squares to get quarter square triangles. So it's kind of, I have this or do I want that? It's just another way of getting to the same end. So it just means that if I have narrow strips, I can cut my pieces. And if I have large pieces, I can work with squares. But sometimes it's more efficient to get down to the using strips to do that. So your choice on how you decide to cut out your setting triangles. Just make sure that they're properly oriented. Okay, Sharon says hello from Illinois. Wonderful. We are glad you're here. Okay, now when it comes to laying this out, I started on it and started sewing it and then said, oh, I have to stop or I won't have anything to demo. So here we go. I am going to expand this back out in front of you, just how I had it on my ironing surface up in my studio. So you can see the process, if I get over here, of setting this up so that you can see the process of offsetting. That's my last piece there. And trying to keep them in order, I had to do my little pin method. If you haven't followed me very much in the past, I use a silly method of putting pins at the top of each strip. And if you can notice there, those 2 pins make a V. Do you know your Roman numerals? That's 5, 6, 7. So the number of pins tells me which row. Instead of having to use 7 pins in something, I decided, those Roman numerals we learned in school give me a little bit of a shortcut so that I don't have to use 10 pins. I can make an X. Wonderful. So I guess maybe the Romans gave us something that was useful. Okay, here we go. Now, See, when I talk about learning how to arrange pieces and color, this is where it gets a little dicey because I had only so many red pieces in my pre-cut pack. So the red had to get scattered throughout my project. And there were some light fabrics in there, and I have a fairly light setting fabric. So those lighter ones with designs on them had to kind of end up inside the project, not on the outer edge, or it would just kind of bleed out into my setting and you wouldn't see a definition there. Okay, Roberta says, thanks for the half and quarter and the quarter inch explanation. It's imperative that we learn kind of those basic tools about where bias edges should be, just so we have success, because bias means stretch. And it also means if it ends up in a large quilt and ends up on a bed, that the stretch as you pull a quilt up can cause quilting threads and even piecing threads to break and on that pull of that fabric. So best practices always first. It doesn't take long to learn where to put bias edges. So if we get those foundational kind of stepping stones in place, then we can have success all along. Okay, so as we begin to put this together, you will also note on your pattern that there is a diagram at the bottom of the page, and it talks about those diagonal rows and it has them all labeled. And then you will find that I put in arrows of which direction to press your seam allowances so that when you go to join the rows together, that you have opposing seams. It is so nice to be able to pick up a row, have opposing seams right there, and have everything locked together nicely so that you get the points that you're looking for. It's just one more step in helping you have success in your project. So as we're putting these rows together, the first row that put together, actually the first thing that I labeled is a setting triangle. It's a corner. So he just lays out here waiting to get put together with everybody else. Then we go to row 2 and we're actually making something that looks like this. We have setting triangles on both sides of a square. And at first, when you go to pick it up, you're going to want to go back to the orientation. You lay it out, make sure you have it correct because it's making a corner. Okay, and your straight of grain is here and your straight of grain is here. Now, when putting these together, sometimes people will say, well, how do I know that I have the pieces oriented properly? I've got the other end, the mirror image of this guy over here. I'm going to show you the placement so that you can align your edges properly because you do have some dog ears. And at first, when you pick them up, if you haven't worked at diagonal sets yet, you're going to like, where do I line this square up in the middle of this triangle side? Do I have a little piece hanging over both sides? Do I slide it to one side or the other? And the answer is slide it to one side. And I'll show you the front side, what I'm looking at here, like this, so that the long diagonal kind of extends out here into no man's land. We've got a right angle here. That's where that little divot on the top of your triangle, remember, triangle has a kind of a flat top. That's where it gets aligned with your square so that it's in there properly. Now, if I would take this to the sewing machine right now, I'm not even sure which side I'm sewing. So literally keep it close by the machine so that you can double check yourself, because as I pick that up, I'm like, I'm going to sew the wrong sides together because it's such a small piece. So I'm going to go back and do my double check, lay it out properly, lay it right sides together. And then before I pick it up, this is my clue. Put one pin into the edge that you're actually going to stitch together, because that will tell you when you get it to the machine, machine goes over here on that side with the pin, not the other edge that's available. Okay, let's get this stitched together using your best 1/4 inch seam. In the first row, you're just putting, or row 2 technically, you're only putting together one square and 2 setting triangles. and then it grows as you make your way across the project. Okay, let's trim our threads, trying to keep everything tidy as we go. Okay, so I've got this one stitched together. Now I'm going to open it up temporarily so I can go and put the other piece on, laying it back where it's going to finally rest. And I'm going to put that right sides together. Align my pieces. I'm going to pop the pin in there. It's kind of obvious now where I'm going to stitch because otherwise the other triangle would be in the way. Okay. But if you have to walk from one room to another with your pieces, I'll guarantee you'll be just like me and sew together the wrong edge at some point. Or you could do it multiple times like I have done. And I'm like, okay, just put the pin in, mark where you're supposed to start. I mean, X marks the spot, right? Even as children, we learned to look for the starting point in a puzzle or in a game so that we all knew where to begin. And doesn't change as we get older, I'm afraid. Okay, now I have triangles on both sides, like this. And now I go to reference my pressing chart because I want to make sure that as I went along, I was pressing everything in alternate directions. And in that last one, I'm going to be pressing my seam allowances toward the top, so that direction. I'm going to finger press this one just very gently and this one so that when I get to my iron, that I will know which direction I'm pressing my seam allowances. And then with a hot iron, make sure that I open my seam allowances all the way open. We don't want to leave a false stitch in there. We want to press it all the way open to the seam allowance. There we go. And now he goes back in place there. Now, when I talked about aligning these pieces, you'll notice that there's squares that the squares don't line up square against each other. They're offset by that triangle. So making sure that you see that as you lay things out. And at this point, my entire project is missing its outer corners. Remember I said this little guy is left over here. I've got one for here, one for here, and one for here. Those I tend to put those on at the very end as I finish a project. So we're going to keep these together for the very final outer edge. And I want to talk about joining two pieces together here. As you can work from either direction at this point. I've got everything laid out. I've got all of my seam allowances going in alternate directions so that as I join these together, I will have opposing seams. Just makes life sweet. So I'm going to pick up the ones closest to the machine for now. I'm going to work this way. So I'm going to put this piece on top of the piece next to it. And this is where those opposing seams, you'll see all the seam allowances in that one are going off this direction. These now are going also that direction, but opposite. So I'm going to look at it from the back. Let me get my felt board here so you can see a little bit of a quilt thread nest there, but you can see that my opposing seams are going to happen as I stitch this together. So we're going to pick these up and put them together so you can see how easily that works. I wish all patterns could have pressing directions, but sometimes there's really not a helpful direction because of the construction of different pieces. It just happens in this one, it works. So that's why you don't always see the pressing instructions given for every pattern. Number one, it does take real estate to actually diagram and put that portion into the pattern. And other times it becomes a personal choice because of the various piecing techniques. Okay, here we go. We've got those first two rows joined together. So now I'm going to press seam allowances out and away. It doesn't matter which direction. I just pick one direction at this point and press all of them in one direction. So I'm going to give that a quick press, and then we can talk about the outer edge and how we finish off our project altogether. Okay, we'll put this back in here. We would go ahead then and join the next 2 rows together. Again, you get those great opposing seams. When you're all done, go back and put in your corners. So your little triangles that you cut. Remember that blunted corner there? Well, if things all work out properly, that blunted corner now is aligned bluntly with this beginning spot here. How sweet is that? Doesn't always happen in every instance, but a lot of times those are blunted. They're going to be trimmed anyway, but they would be dog ears on the end. So just remember that you haven't cut anything wrong if you have a blunted edge there using that tool. Let's put this last seam on here so we can talk about trimming that outer edge and what to look for before we put our inner border on. We have little triangles flying out everywhere here. You can see I've got the little dog ears here that need to be trimmed, but I'm going to be pressing this seam allowance up and away like this. Just finger press it for now. Okay, we're going to pretend that everything has been joined together. Now you know why I put my pin method in there, so that later I'll remember which direction everything goes, because all the pins are in a row, so that's the top edge. Okay, when we get to this point, you'll want to, and you have everything assembled for your quilt top, you're going to want to go back and trim the outer edge before you join your inner border and outer borders to the quilt patchwork piece. And the idea is that you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance from the intersection of your squares to the outer edge. So that's where you're going to want to look to trim, so that from this corner, or each of the corners here, you're going to use those kind of as guideposts along the sides of your project, straight out to the outer border, not at an angle, but straight out to the outer edge. You want to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So by using probably a larger ruler than this, but one that I have available right now, is to take that ruler, put it on top, look for a 1/4 inch outside of those points of the charm squares, so that you have it squared up. And once you kind of note all the way along that you have 1/4 inch seam allowance left behind, you do not want to trim to that point. You want to go a 1/4 inch outside of it, because we need our seam allowance in order to attach the next portion of our project. So I'm going to trim just a tiny, tiny amount here. We only offset our pieces, or make our setting triangles just big enough by a little bit so that we can go in and trim. I'm going to leave that behind. So really, we're only trimming scraps literally off of that, so that now you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance left at each of these points all the way around your project. And then you will take the pieces that you cut for inner border and outer. The inner border will go the long sides first. Usually the construction order is always long sides first, so long sides first, then the short ends. Then you will take your outer border, long sides first, and it tells you the dimensions to cut your borders. Put that along, and then you will make your binding out of the 2.5 inch strips that you have. And once you've quilted your project, finished with binding, your Christmas candy will be ready for your Christmas table. So the quilting is very simple. You can see on the original, I just did straight lines. A lot of times we're getting finished up in a hurry, maybe for a holiday. So straight lines are totally fine to do your quilting. You can play around and do some free motion if you like, but this is a good lesson on color placement and diagonal sets. If you're wanting other patterns, we do have a fall pattern out there. Squirrel's Delight was a project that I did last fall, and my moderator will put up a link for that if you'd like to download Squirrel's Delight. There's a little time before Thanksgiving yet if you'd like to make mug mats or a hot pad to decorate in your kitchen. But other than that, thanks for joining me for Christmas Candy Table Runner or Table Topper. Thanks for joining me.